Leo handed me a crumpled $200 bill while I was still coughing from the pneumonia, telling me his new golden retriever needed my bedroom more than I did at 68 years old today. My lungs burned in the December cold as I stared at the luxury condo I had paid for by selling my auto shop, now facing a 4-mile walk to a freezing storage unit downtown. They thought they were discarding a broken old man with nowhere left to turn, but they did not realize my past kindness was about to come back and change our lives forever very soon. My name is Arthur Vance, I am 68 years old, and for 35 years, I ran Vance's Precision Motors in Indianapolis before giving up every single thing I owned to secure my future. I spent my life covered in oil and grease, working 14-hour days so Leo could attend private schools and wear the designer clothes that I could never afford for myself as a young father. When I finally retired and sold my shop for $600,000, I did not keep a penny for my own comfort, instead putting it all toward the down payment for Leo's expensive penthouse. I believed that family was a circle of protection, and that by providing my son with a foundation of wealth, I was ensuring a warm place for my own sunset years to be spent safely. For the first few months, life in the high-rise was a dream, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline and a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a high-end magazine. I tried to stay useful by fixing every squeaky hinge and polishing the marble counters until they shone, hoping my presence was not a burden to Leo and his new wife, a woman named Sarah. Sarah was 29, worked in high-end real estate, and she viewed the world through a lens of aesthetic perfection that did not have much room for an old mechanic with calloused, stained hands. She began making subtle comments about the industrial smell that followed me into the living room, even after I had showered and put on the clean, expensive clothes that my son Leo had bought me. I started eating my meals in my small bedroom to avoid her judgmental stares, listening to the muffled sounds of their laughter as they hosted dinner parties for people I did not even know. My room was the smallest in the penthouse, tucked away near the laundry area, but I was grateful for the 4 walls and the roof that my own life's work had provided for us all. Everything began to spiral downward in late November when a bitter cold front moved through the city and I woke up with a rattling, deep-seated cough that felt like a very heavy, painful weight. I did not want to worry Leo, so I tried to suppress the noise with heavy blankets, but the sound echoed through the high ceilings and drew Sarah's immediate and very visible disgust every morning. She told Leo that my illness was a biohazard and that she could not risk her health or her social reputation by having a sick old man coughing all over her pristine and white designer furniture. I asked for a simple bottle of cough syrup, but Sarah claimed they were out of money for extras this month because they had just invested in a high-society charity event for expensive pets. The fever came next, a shimmering heat that made the walls of the penthouse blur and shake, leaving me shivering on my thin mattress while I listened to them arguing loudly in the modern kitchen. Sarah's voice was like a shard of ice, insisting that the spare room was the only logical place to put the new golden retriever puppy they were adopting from a famous and championship pedigree breeder. She argued that the dog needed a sterilized, quiet environment for its training, and that an unhealthy elder was simply taking up valuable square footage that could be put to a much better use. I waited for Leo to remind her that I was the one who paid the $600,000 for this home, but he remained silent, his loyalty bought by her beauty and her ambition. On a Tuesday morning, while I was struggling to even stand up, Leo walked into my room with a look of feigned sympathy and told me that things just were not working out anymore today. He said that Sarah was stressed and that for the sake of his marriage, I needed to find a new place to stay until my health improved and I was presentable for their elite company. He reached into his pocket and produced $200 in small bills, sliding them across the nightstand as if he were paying off a debt to a stranger instead of to his own father. I looked at the money and then at the son I had raised alone after his mother died, realizing that I had built a man who valued a dog more than his own flesh. Sarah entered the room behind him, holding a designer leash and a bag of organic dog treats, her eyes cold as she told me that my things were already packed and in the hallway. I had no strength to fight, so I gathered my 2 old suitcases and shuffled toward the elevator, the sound of my own ragged breathing the only goodbye I received from my only family. The winter air hit me like a physical blow as I stepped onto the sidewalk, my lungs screaming in protest as I began the long walk toward the industrial district of the large city. I could not afford a motel with only $200 in my pocket, especially not with the prices in Indianapolis during the peak of the holiday season and the freezing, bitter winter weather. I walked toward the storage facility where I kept the last remains of my shop, the heavy steel tools and the old diagnostic equipment that no one wanted to buy when I finally retired. The facility manager looked at me with pity as I swiped my access card, but he did not say a word as I dragged my suitcases toward Unit 412 in the back corner lot. The metal door groaned as I lifted it, revealing a 10 by 10 space filled with the shadows of my former life and the biting cold that seeped through the corrugated steel walls. I laid out my old canvas shop apron and a few thick rags to create a bed of sorts, shivering violently as the temperature dropped below freezing and the winter sun began to set. Every time I coughed, the sound bounced off the metal walls, a lonely reminder that I was now an unwanted ghost living among the rusted relics of a life spent serving others very faithfully. I thought about the luxury penthouse and the warm bed that now belonged to a dog, and for the first time in 68 years, I let the tears fall down my weathered face. I felt like a failure, a man who had worked himself to the bone only to end up in a cage of steel, forgotten by the person I loved most in the entire world. The fever dreams returned that night, and in the darkness of the storage unit, I found myself drifting back to a rainy night 25 years ago at my old mechanic shop in town. A battered sedan had sputtered into my bay just as I was locking up, and a young man with a terrified expression jumped out, begging me to look at his smoking radiator immediately. He told me he was 22, completely broke, and had a final interview for a coding job that was his only chance to escape the crushing poverty he had known since his childhood. I could see the desperation in his eyes, a reflection of the same fire I had felt when I was young and trying to build a better life for my son, Leo, back then. I spent 3 hours under the hood of his car, using my own spare parts to fix the leak and tune the engine until it hummed with the precision of a brand new vehicle. When he asked for the bill, I looked at his empty wallet and his worn-out suit, and I simply wiped my hands on a rag and told him the repair was on the house. I even reached into my own pocket and gave him the last $100 I had earned that day, telling him to buy a decent meal and some gas for the long trip. He cried right there in my shop, promising me that he would never forget the man who helped him when the rest of the world had turned its back on his desperate plea. He asked for my business card and my name, Arthur Vance, and he tucked it into his briefcase with a look of such profound gratitude that it stayed with me for many years. I dragged my suitcases 4 miles through the slushy Indiana streets, my chest burning with every breath as I headed toward the only place I still had a key for, my storage unit. The storage facility was a bleak landscape of corrugated metal and asphalt, a place where people hid the things they no longer had room for in their actual lives and their happy homes. I opened Unit 412, the smell of old motor oil and cold steel greeting me like a ghost from my past, offering a hollow comfort that was better than my son's rejection. I laid out my old canvas shop apron and some tattered moving blankets on the concrete, creating a bed that felt like a coffin as the winter sun dipped below the horizon today. The fever took hold of me that night, twisting my thoughts into a chaotic blur of memories, mostly centered around the shop and the years of labor I had poured into it all. I found myself thinking of a Tuesday evening in 1999, when the rain was coming down in sheets and a beat-up sedan had sputtered into my bay just as I was closing. A young man named Elias, barely 22 and shaking with nerves, told me he had a job interview that could change his life, but his radiator had finally given up the ghost. He did not have a dime to his name, but I saw the fire in his eyes, a desperate hope that reminded me of why I worked so hard for my own family back. I stayed open late, fixed his car with parts one had in the back, and even gave him the $100 I had set aside for Leo's new bicycle that very same week. I told him to go win that job and never look back, laughing off his promises to pay me back one day because I believed in helping people when they were down and out. Now, as I lay shivering on a concrete floor in a metal box, I realized the bitter irony of a life spent helping others only to be discarded by my own flesh and blood. By the 3rd day in the unit, my cough had turned into a wet, painful rattle, and I knew that if help did not come soon, I would be found by the manager. I was drifting in a haze of cold and pain when I heard the heavy sound of a high-end engine idling outside, followed by the crunch of gravel under expensive leather shoes. My metal door was suddenly hoisted upward, and the bright winter light flooded the unit, reflecting off the polished chrome of a luxury black sedan parked just a few feet away from me. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit stood in the doorway, clutching a digital tablet and looking at my face with a level of intensity that made me feel seen once again. He stepped inside, ignoring the smell of sickness and old grease, and asked in a clear, professional voice if I was the Arthur Vance who once owned a shop on 10th Street in town. I managed a weak nod, my voice failing me, as the man introduced himself as Marcus Thorne, a senior partner at a law firm I knew only by its prestigious and powerful reputation. Marcus knelt down beside my makeshift bed, telling me that he had been searching for me across 3 states and dozens of property records for the better part of 6 months now today. He explained that his primary client, a man named Elias Sterling, had recently passed away and had left a very specific mandate in his multi-billion-dollar will regarding a certain old mechanic. My heart hammered as Marcus explained that Elias had never forgotten the man who gave him a chance in 1999, and he had spent years trying to find me to say thanks. Elias had become one of the most successful tech pioneers in the country, but he had always credited that one night at Vance's Precision Motors as the turning point of his entire life. Marcus opened a leather folder and showed me a photograph of a smiling, older version of the boy I had helped, along with a signed letter addressed directly to the mechanic who helped. The letter thanked me for the $100 and the repair, stating that those 2 things had saved him from a life of poverty and allowed him to build a massive global empire. Marcus then dropped the real bombshell, informing me that Elias had left me the majority share of his residential real estate trust, making me a very wealthy man almost overnight in the city. I sat there in my filthy coveralls, listening to him list the properties I now owned, including several luxury high-rises in the most exclusive parts of the downtown Indianapolis area today. I realized with a jolt of shock that the very building where Leo and Sarah lived was part of the Sterling Trust, and I was now technically the owner of their entire home. Marcus did not wait for my reaction. He signaled to a medical team waiting in the sedan, and they rushed forward with a stretcher and warm blankets to take me away immediately. He promised me that as soon as I was recovered, he would walk me through the legal power I now held over the properties and the tenants who lived within them right now. As they lifted me into the ambulance, I looked back at the cold storage unit one last time, knowing that the man who entered it was dead, and a new man was born. I closed my eyes as the sirens faded, a single thought echoing in my mind: it was finally time to show Leo and Sarah exactly what happens when you treat family like trash. The white hospital lights were blinding after the darkness of that storage unit, but for the first time in weeks, the air in my lungs was clean and the warmth was finally absolute today. Marcus Thorne sat by my bedside for 3 days, explaining how Elias Sterling had built a tech empire worth billions before setting aside this massive real estate trust specifically for my future security and comfort. He showed me the legal documents confirming that the Sterling Trust owned over 40 luxury buildings across the Midwest, including the high-rise where my son Leo currently lives with his wife Sarah and their dog. I looked at my hands, which were still stained with the faint traces of engine oil, and realized I was now the landlord of the very people who had cast me out into the cold. The medical staff treated me like royalty once they realized Marcus was my personal attorney, providing the best care Indianapolis had to offer while I regained my physical strength and my mental clarity this week. As the pneumonia cleared, a cold and hard resolve settled into my chest, replacing the fatherly hurt with the strategic mind of a man who had survived 35 years of running a profitable business. Marcus handed me a new smartphone and a credit card with a limit I could not even fathom, telling me that Elias wanted me to never want for anything ever again in my life. I spent my first afternoon out of the hospital at a tailor on Meridian Street, being fitted for a charcoal wool suit that cost more than my first 3 service trucks combined back in the day. Looking in the mirror, I barely recognized the man staring back at me. The tired mechanic was gone, replaced by someone who looked like he belonged in a high-rise boardroom overlooking the entire city skyline today. We went to a private office where Marcus laid out the financial ledgers for the penthouse building, and what I saw in those documents made my blood turn into cold ice within my very veins. It turned out that Leo had been struggling to keep up with the steep monthly association fees and the property taxes, relying on Sarah's commissions to stay afloat in their luxury and expensive social world. They had been projecting an image of extreme wealth to their elite friends while secretly drowning in debt and falling behind on their payments to the very trust one now fully and legally controlled. Sarah had even petitioned the building management for a discount on their fees, claiming they were burdened by the expenses of an elderly relative who was no longer living in their home or taking resources. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow as I realized they were using my supposed departure as a tool to gain more financial sympathy from a company that I now officially and legally owned. I told Marcus to freeze all pending requests from their unit and to prepare a full audit of their residency status, wanting every single detail documented before I made my move to visit them today. I spent 2 more days in a quiet luxury hotel, resting my body and planning the exact moment I would return to the penthouse to reclaim the dignity they had stolen away from me earlier. I kept that crumpled $200 bill Leo had given me in my pocket, a constant reminder of the price he had placed on his father's life during that freezing and dark winter night. On Friday morning, I climbed into the back of a black car with Marcus, feeling the smooth leather and the quiet hum of an engine that I knew was perfectly tuned and maintained by experts. As we pulled up to the front of the luxury high-rise, the doorman, a young man named Tommy who I had once tipped well, didn't even recognize me in my new and expensive designer attire. He opened the door with a practiced bow, welcoming us to the building as if I were a visiting dignitary instead of the man who had been shivering in a storage unit just days ago. We walked straight to the building manager's office, where a man named Mr. Henderson looked up with a startled expression when he saw Marcus Thorne walking through his glass front door with a serious look. Marcus didn't waste any time, introducing me as the new chairman of the Sterling Trust and the primary owner of the entire property, effective immediately according to the legal transition documents he carried in hand. Henderson's face went pale as he scrambled to pull up my file, his hands shaking as he realized the man standing before him was the same person he had ignored weeks before in the lobby. I asked him to pull up the records for Unit 24B, the penthouse, and to show me the latest correspondence regarding their late fees and their recent requests for financial assistance from the trust. He showed me a letter signed by Sarah, stating that they were finally free of the financial burden of my medical care and could now commit to a new payment plan for their home soon. My heart hardened into a stone as I read her lies, seeing how easily she had traded my life for a chance to keep her status in this cold and hollow building full of strangers. I told Henderson that I would be conducting a personal inspection of that unit today, and I required him to accompany us to ensure that all building policies were being followed correctly by the tenants. We rode the private elevator up to the top floor, the same one I had descended in shame just 2 weeks ago with nothing but 2 suitcases and a failing pair of lungs and heart. The hallway smelled of expensive lilies and floor wax, a sterile scent that reminded me of how Sarah wanted everything to be perfect and free of any human mess or struggle within her perfect sight. I stood in front of the massive oak doors of the penthouse, hearing the faint sound of a dog barking inside, the golden retriever that had taken my place in this home and my bed. I signaled for Marcus to step back and let me lead, wanting my son to see exactly who was standing on the other side of the door before the lawyers started talking to them today. I raised my hand and knocked firmly, the sound echoing through the quiet hallway like a hammer strike in my old shop, signaling the end of their era of cold-hearted and selfish cruelty today. Sarah opened the door after a few moments, wearing a silk robe and holding a glass of green juice, her expression shifting from annoyance to pure confusion as she looked at me in my suit. She didn't recognize me at first, her eyes sweeping over my expensive suit and the professional men standing behind me, before they finally settled on my face with a look of pure and absolute horror. "Arthur," she stammered, her voice dropping an octave as she realized I wasn't the broken man she had evicted, but someone who carried the weight of true authority and vast personal power in this building. I didn't say a word as I stepped past her into the foyer, my polished shoes clicking on the marble floors I had paid for with 35 years of hard manual labor and sweat. The golden retriever puppy came running toward me, jumping up with a friendly wag, and I reached down to pat its head, noting that the dog had more heart than its owners ever showed me. Leo came walking out of the kitchen, his face turning as white as a sheet when he saw his father standing in the middle of his living room looking like a billionaire for the first. "Dad, what are you doing here?" he asked, his voice trembling as he looked at Marcus and the building manager, sensing that the world he had built was about to come crashing down on him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the $200 bill he had given me, dropping it onto the marble coffee table with a look of quiet and profound disappointment in his character. I told him I was here to return his generous gift, as I no longer had any need for a cheap motel or a freezing storage unit in the middle of this bitter Indiana winter. Sarah tried to recover her composure, stepping forward to claim that I was trespassing and that they would call the police if I didn't leave their private residence immediately this very minute of the day. Mr. Henderson stepped forward then, his voice shaking as he informed her that I was not a guest, but the new owner of the entire Sterling building and their current and legal landlord of record. The silence that followed was deafening, as the reality of my new position began to sink in, turning their arrogance into a desperate and visible fear that was very satisfying to witness after my pain. Leo looked at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, while Sarah began to stammer out a series of excuses about how they were just trying to protect me from the flu and the cold. I walked over to the large window overlooking the city, seeing the storage facility in the distance and remembering the cold that had nearly taken my life just a few long days and nights ago. I told them that I had reviewed their financial records and noticed they were 3 months behind on their fees, a violation that allowed for immediate eviction under the new building trust rules and laws. Sarah's face twisted in a mask of panic as she realized that the home she had worked so hard to curate was now entirely at the mercy of the man she had cruelly insulted. She began to beg, her voice high and frantic, claiming that they could pay the debt if I just gave them a little more time to sort out their messy finances this coming week. I looked at my son, the boy I had sacrificed everything for, and asked him if he remembered the night he handed me that money and told me to leave my own home for good. He didn't answer, his shoulders slumping as the weight of his betrayal finally seemed to settle on his soul, leaving him looking small and pathetic in his own expensive and designer living room today. I told Marcus to begin the formal eviction process for Unit 24B, effective immediately, citing the numerous violations of the building's code of conduct and the unpaid financial debts they currently owed. Sarah screamed that I couldn't do this to my own family, but I simply looked at her and reminded her that she was the one who defined what family meant to them and to me. I walked toward the bedroom that used to be mine, seeing the expensive dog bed and the toys scattered across the floor where I used to sleep and dream of my son's future happiness. I told the building manager to have the dog's things moved to a professional kennel at my expense, as I would be reclaiming this room for a much more important and personal purpose starting today. Leo finally spoke, his voice a broken whisper, asking me where they were supposed to go with no money and no place to live in the middle of a very cold and unforgiving winter. I reached into my bag and pulled out a stack of brochures for the local storage facility where I had stayed, suggesting they might find the rates there to be very affordable and fair. The look on Sarah's face was one of pure, unadulterated shock, as she realized I was handing back the same cruelty she had served to me without a single ounce of hesitation or any mercy. I informed them they had exactly 48 hours to pack their belongings and vacate the premises, or the sheriff would be called to remove them by force from my building before the weekend. Marcus handed them the legal paperwork, his expression professional and cold, as he explained the consequences of failing to comply with the official eviction notice from the Sterling Trust's legal department at this time. I walked out of the penthouse without looking back, the sound of Sarah's frantic sobbing following me into the hallway as I headed toward the elevator to start my new life of peace and power. We went down to the lobby where I instructed the staff that Leo and Sarah were no longer permitted in the building's common areas once their 48 hours had officially and legally expired. I spent the afternoon at the law firm, signing the final documents that secured my control over the vast fortune Elias had left behind for the man who once saved his broken car and dreams. I decided to set up a charitable foundation in Elias's name, dedicated to helping retired tradespeople who had fallen on hard times and needed a safe place to live and recover their health and dignity. I bought a small, modest house on the outskirts of town, a place with a large garage and plenty of room for my old tools and the memories of my former shop and life.
No sound
I didn't need a penthouse or a fancy high-rise to be happy, but I did need to know that my life's work hadn't been wasted on people who didn't value my heart or my presence. 2 days later, I watched from my car across the street as Leo and Sarah loaded their remaining possessions into a rented truck, looking defeated and weary in the gray and cold winter light. They had no friends left to turn to, as their social circle had quickly vanished once the news of their financial ruin and their eviction had spread through the elite high-rise community they loved. I saw the golden retriever puppy sitting in the front seat of the truck, and I hoped that the dog would find a better life than the one my son had chosen for himself today. I drove away before they could see me, heading back to my new home where the fireplace was crackling and the air was filled with the scent of pine and fresh morning coffee. I spent the evening sorting through my old photographs, looking at pictures of Leo when he was a boy and wondering where I had gone wrong in teaching him about true love and family. I realized that sometimes, the greatest lesson a father can give his child is the consequence of their own actions, a hard truth that is often more valuable than any inheritance or gold today. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't known in years, knowing that I was finally safe and that the legacy of Elias Sterling was being put to a good and honorable use. I picked up my old wrench and began to clean it, the familiar weight in my hand a grounding reminder of who I was and the life I had built with true integrity. The winter was still cold outside, but my heart was warm, and I knew that the spare room in my new house would always be open for someone who truly deserved it. I sat in my new living room on Oak Street, the smell of fresh cedar and motor oil from the attached garage creating a sense of home that I hadn't felt in decades. My hands were still rough and stained, but now they moved with a purpose as I organized the heavy steel wrenches and diagnostic tools that had once been my entire life and legacy. The Sterling Foundation was officially incorporated by Thursday morning, with Marcus Thorne handling the legal complexities while I focused on the mission of protecting the dignity of retired blue-collar workers everywhere. We secured an old warehouse on the south side of Indianapolis, planning to convert it into a safe haven for seniors who had spent their lives building the very infrastructure of this city. I visited the site often, wearing my old work boots and a warm flannel coat, feeling the cold Indiana wind on my face without the fear of having nowhere to go at night. Word began to spread among the local community about the mechanic who had inherited a fortune and was now using it to ensure that no honest worker ever faced a freezing storage unit. I received a letter from Leo 3 weeks after the eviction, postmarked from a cramped motel on the edge of town where he and Sarah were reportedly struggling to find any permanent housing. He begged for a second chance, claiming that he had finally seen the error of his ways and that Sarah's influence had clouded his judgment during those dark and desperate months in the penthouse. I read his words several times by the light of my fireplace, feeling a flicker of the old fatherly love before remembering the cold marble floors and the dog in my old room. I decided not to reply with anger, but with the same clinical distance that a professional mechanic uses when a piece of machinery is simply too broken to be repaired safely anymore today. I instructed Marcus to set up a small educational trust for Leo, one that would only provide funds if he enrolled in a trade school and learned the value of honest labor. It was the only way I knew how to save him from the entitlement that had rotted his character, giving him a path to redemption through the same sweat and grit I knew. Sarah left him shortly after the money ran out, moving back to her parents' house in another state and leaving Leo to face the consequences of their collective choices alone in the city. I heard that the golden retriever puppy had been adopted by a loving family with a large yard, a small mercy that made me smile as I worked in my quiet garage. One Tuesday afternoon, a young man knocked on my door, holding a rusted alternator and looking for the famous Arthur Vance who knew everything about the engines of the late 20th century cars. He was 24, working 2 jobs to keep his mother's old sedan running, and he reminded me so much of Elias Sterling that my chest tightened with a sudden and profound grief. I invited him into the shop, showing him how to test the copper windings and replace the brushes, sharing the knowledge that had been locked away in my mind for far too long. Teaching him became a new form of medicine for my soul, a way to connect with the future without the bitterness of the past clouding my vision or my steady hands. The Sterling Foundation opened its doors in late March, providing 36 furnished apartments for retired mechanics, carpenters, and plumbers who had nowhere else to call home in their final and golden years. I stood on the small stage at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, looking out at the faces of men and women who knew the true value of a hard day's work and family. I told them the story of the $100 and the radiator repair from 25 years ago, reminding everyone that a single act of kindness can echo through time. Marcus Thorne stood by my side, a loyal friend who had become more like family to me than the son I had raised with such high hopes and dreams for his personal future. I kept the deed to the penthouse building in a safe deposit box, never intending to step foot in that hollow place again, but keeping it as a symbol of my hard-won victory. I donated the apartment association fees to a local animal shelter, ensuring that other dogs like the one who replaced me would have a warm bed and plenty of food and care. My health returned fully as the spring air warmed the Indiana landscape, the rattle in my chest replaced by a steady rhythm that spoke of a man who had finally found peace. I spent my weekends driving my restored 1967 pickup truck through the countryside, the engine humming perfectly because I had tuned it myself with the precision that only decades of experience can provide. I often thought about the spare room in my new house, which stayed empty and clean, a silent testament to the fact that I would never again be pushed out of my home. Leo eventually started his first semester at the vocational college, sending me a short postcard with a picture of his first successful welding project and a note of sincere and humble gratitude. I didn't invite him over yet, knowing that some wounds take more than a few months to heal, but I felt a quiet spark of hope for the man he might still become. I realized that my legacy wasn't the penthouse or the billion-dollar trust, but the integrity I had maintained even when I was shivering on a concrete floor in the middle of winter. Every morning, I woke up at dawn, brewing a pot of strong coffee and sitting on my porch to watch the neighborhood wake up and begin its daily routine of work and life. I was no longer the invisible grandfather or the inconvenient burden, but a man of substance and history who was respected by his peers and valued by his community for his heart. The storage unit manager, Bill, stopped by one afternoon to return a small box of family photos I had left behind in my haste to leave that metal cage behind forever and always. We sat in the garage for 2 hours, talking about the old days when cars were made of real steel and people kept their word even when it was difficult or costly. I gave Bill a position at the Sterling Foundation, knowing he was a good man who had shown me a small kindness when I was at my absolute lowest point in my life. My life felt full and rich, not because of the money in the bank, but because I had reclaimed my name and my dignity from the people who tried to steal it. I walked through the halls of the Sterling Foundation's main building, seeing the residents playing chess and sharing stories of their years spent on the assembly lines and the construction sites downtown. I saw an elderly woman named Martha who had been a nurse for 40 years, now safe and warm in an apartment that overlooked the park where her grandchildren played every afternoon. She thanked me with a gentle smile, and I felt a sense of fulfillment that no luxury condo or high society party could ever provide to a man with a blue-collar soul. I finally understood that the debt Elias Sterling felt he owed me was paid in full every time I saw a person regain their self-respect after the world had tried to discard them. I stood in my workshop as the sun began to set, the golden light reflecting off the polished tools that were now as much a part of me as my own weathered skin. I reached into my pocket and found an old business card from Vance's Precision Motors, a relic of a time when I thought my only value was in the work of my hands. I placed it on the workbench, knowing that the man who owned that shop would be proud of the man who now stood in this new house with a heart of peace. The air in the garage was still and quiet, the only sound being the ticking of an old grandfather clock that I had repaired and brought back to life with my own hands. I walked back into the kitchen, the warmth of the house wrapping around me like a familiar blanket, a stark contrast to the cold metal walls of Unit 412 in storage. I prepared a simple dinner for myself, enjoying the quiet solitude of a life that was finally mine to control and protect without the interference of selfish or entitled family members today. I knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges, but I was no longer afraid of the dark or the cold because I had built a foundation that could never be broken. I looked out the window at the stars shining over Indianapolis, thinking about the thousands of small acts of kindness that keep this world turning even when things seem dark and unfair. I was Arthur Vance, a mechanic, a father, and a survivor who had turned a spare room for a dog into a legacy of hope for an entire city of hardworking people. I sat down in my favorite chair and closed my eyes, listening to the steady and peaceful breath of a man who was finally, and for the very first time, truly at home.